So this year, to celebrate Disability Pride Month, we are excited to welcome Haley Moss, a lawyer, neurodiversity expert, and author, to share her insights into rethinking neurodiversity in the legal industry. Haley was diagnosed with autism at the age of 3 and is the first openly autistic lawyer in Florida. She is also the author of 4 books that guide neurodivergent individuals through professional and personal challenges, including her book, Great Minds Think Differently: Neurodiversity for Lawyers and Other Professionals. Haley is determined to make the world more accessible and inclusive for people with disabilities, encourage others to embrace neurodiversity. So with that, welcome Haley.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for joining us today. I know that for those of us who are joining live, there's so much that you could be doing on a Monday, no matter where you are in the world, whether it is early in the morning, lunchtime, whatever it may be. So I just wanted to start with a note of gratitude. And it really means a lot that we're celebrating Disability Pride Month, because I remember a time when we weren't having these conversations. I remember being in law school and being looked at like I had 3 heads for even wanting to talk about neurodiversity. So we've really come a long way, and that all makes me extremely excited. So I'm looking forward to our discussion today and getting to learn with all of you. And we also get to get some CLE in the process. So that's very exciting, I know, for many of us, myself included. So I always look forward to getting to learn and also have fun at the same time. But before we get started, I do want to talk about accessibility. How can we not talk about Disability Pride Month and disability-related topics without talking about access? I take inclusion as seriously as I possibly can. I want things to feel accessible to as many of you as possible. So to help with that, I do want to give a couple housekeeping notes. I know Joe covered some of this for us as well, but I want us to keep in mind that it's not up to one individual or organization to be the one who decides what is or isn't accessible. That access is a team sport. It's something that we do together. So keeping that in mind, I want us to think, okay, we can make things accessible however we can with as many people as possible in mind and making those big decisions. It's not up to me if today is accessible. It's not up to the firm if today is accessible. But we do have a couple of things to help you out here that we worked on to make sure that happens. So we are recording, which means that you can come back at a later time if that's of service to you, or if that's something that you might want to revisit, or if, life gets in the way. I know a lot of us are very busy people. There are closed captions, which means you probably have those nice little live transcripts as well. I find all that usually very helpful. I am a closed captions super fan. And I also want you to know to do what feels best for your brain and body. I know we are not in Zoom webinar, we're in regular Zoom mode, which means there's usually a lot of obligation, feeling that, oh no, I have to have my camera on. Because I've noticed, even just looking at the attendance list, that not all of us are sitting in conference rooms in the office today. So please do what feels best for you in your individual space. You do not have to have your camera on for me. I taught undergrad at one point, and my department chair used to say you have to have your students have your cameras on as a sign of respect for you. And I just sat there like, no, because my students need to do what feels best to help them learn. So I'm the same way with you all. I trust you. Do what you need to do. I understand some of us have the messy office situation going on. Some of us have kids. We have dogs. We have cats. We have babies. We have things going on that maybe we don't want everyone around us to see. Or you're like yours truly, who also minimizes the camera, because staring at my own face for an extended period of time makes me extremely self-conscious. So just a couple of things to keep in mind. Do what you need to do. If you need to stand up, you need to take a break, you need to fidget and fiddle your fingers or whatever it is, I do not care. I do not judge you. Do what feels best for your brain and body. I also know, depending on what part of the world you are in or what part of the country you are in, that it is likely some form of meal time, coffee time, break time, food and beverage related time. Please do not feel like you cannot do that thing. Do the thing that makes you feel good. I am all about it, and I want this to feel accessible to your brain and body. That's the first and foremost thing I want to lead with. So please have your snacks, have your lunch, dinner, breakfast, coffee. I do not care. I want you to be happy. I want you to feel fueled. I want you to feel good. As for slides and resources, I am happy to share them. Y'all should have access to a PDF of the PowerPoint, and I know there's some handouts and other fun things. As for slides, I also know that the native files have alt text and screen reader accessibility built into them. If you do not know what this means, that means that anytime you see pictures, they're going to have some kind of description of what the picture is. For instance, if you took a picture of my face right now, you might get a readout such as Haley is a white woman with red hair and her hair has bangs. She has brown eyes and she is wearing red lipstick and a blue embroidered shirt. Just something like that. That's just enough that if you're joining us over the phone or if you are blind or low vision, you know exactly what's going on. And a screen reader is a cool piece of technology that will read out those types of descriptions to our blind and low vision friends. Kind of a the more you know, and also something that we can be doing in all of our digital content to make it as accessible for as many people as possible. So without further ado, let's get our show on the road and get us kicked off, because I know somehow this hour that we have together is absolutely going to fly by. And I want to make sure that we have time for questions and conversation and all the good stuff to follow. So kind of to kick us off, because it is Disability Pride Month after all, I realize that disability has a huge definition, and that's before we even dive into neurodiversity. And to help us with understanding disability from this bigger picture perspective, I want us to think about this in terms of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and not because that's what we're celebrating during Disability Pride Month is the signing and passage of the ADA, but also because that's the biggest form of guidance that we have legally on what disability is. And the ADA really covers a huge range of conditions and different experiences. Is the definition of a disability under the ADA is physical or mental impairments that substantially limit major life activities. Essentially, something that impacts your brain or body and somehow affects something that you do every single day that's important and most people probably take for granted. And a lot of those things might be your ability to even be present right now, to have a job, to work, to live on your own, to concentrate, to talk, to read, to walk around. All sorts of stuff like this are major life activities. And that's something that I want us to really keep in mind, is that this is a huge definition. It covers about 15% of the global population, about 1 in 4 Americans today, and isn't just limited to the things that we think are pretty obvious or apparent. A lot of the times when we think of disability, we kind of fall into the trap of thinking of things that require accessible parking spaces or things that we can easily observe. Like if someone is blind or deaf or using a wheelchair or other mobility aid. But we also have our cognitive disabilities. We have non-apparent disabilities and health conditions as well that fall into this. So you might have things like diabetes or a chronic illness, or of course something like a learning disability. I really want us to know how broad this is when we talk about disability, because there is no one singular experience. The experience of having a disability is very far ranging. I know this from just even my life, and if you've met one person with even the same condition or disability, you've met exactly one person. But I really want us to keep in mind this diversity when we talk about these topics. And then we get to zero in a little bit more on that cognitive brain component with neurodiversity. When we're thinking about neurodiversity, it kind of is one of those things that sounds like exactly what it is, in that we're talking about having different brains. And every single one of us has a different brain, no matter who you are or where you are. And the way that we process information, communicate, and experience the world is wholly unique. We're not robots, we're not AI. Even just think about how we're doing right now on Zoom today. I am located in Miami. There is currently a very loud thunderstorm and rain falling out the window. There is a chance that you may or may not be able to hear it. And if you are able to hear that, you may or may not be distracted by that. Some people probably find rain sounds in the background very calming. Other people find it distracting, and other people like me only mildly startle when they hear loud thunderclaps. And then it kind of derails my train of thought. But I share that because that's just part of how your brain works. It doesn't mean that you're right. It doesn't mean that you're wrong. And that some of us who still get kind of weirded out with thunderstorms now and then are bad people or we're broken in some way. It's just part of how our brains and how we're processing that information makes sense to us, right? So this is just part of the human experience, just as much as any other diverse trait or something that makes you unique. And this is true no matter who you are. And me having that kind of reaction to, oh no, I can hear things out the window and I'm trying to tune them out, has nothing to do with this, and also everything to do with the fact that our brains work differently, whether you're neurotypical or neurodivergent. And if you've never heard these words before, that's totally okay. When we're thinking about neurotypical people, I want us to think of the majority of us. And when I think about this as a majority, it's a majority of how our brains are thinking and processing information, kind of in line with what society is expecting of us. usually people are quick to say this is the group of people who are normal. And I kind of laugh when people say that because I really don't know what normal is. Like, what's normal to me probably isn't normal to you. And that's just the human experience. And what is normal anyway when we really think about it on a deeper level, because nobody really wants to be normal, come to think of it. Everyone just wants to be unique or special or famous or diligent or hardworking, or you want me to come up with some other adjective to describe you that isn't normal. So let's stay with this is the majority. And then we have our people who are neurodivergent, who are in the minority here. And our neurodivergent folks are people who might be those out of the box thinkers whose brains don't necessarily work in line with what we expect from a societal, cultural, traditional perspective. And really, those differences come along in how we communicate and how we process information and think things through. If you've ever had the chance to work with me or you talk to me for an extended period of time, you will know that I am very honest, very blunt, and I'm very bad at introductions. I am very grateful that we get to do introductions before we launch into programming because introducing myself always feels very awkward. And I'm also just not very good at telling or remembering to tell other people to please introduce themselves. That I've been on many, many calls in this life where I will just launch straight into what we're talking about, or you will ask me how I'm doing, and I will tell you exactly how I'm doing. That isn't just a fine, how are you type answer. Like, I've been on these types of things, and someone has asked me how I'm doing, and I literally sat there, and this was probably a couple months ago, and said, I'm really bummed because I was in the Ticketmaster lottery and I couldn't get Taylor Swift tickets. Like, I've actually said this in a professional setting because someone asked me how I was doing, and that was just what made sense, and that was just me being stereotypically autistic and very, very honest with people. And sometimes it throws them off guard, and sometimes they find it endearing. I've kind of noticed it's a mixed bag on that, but that's just how I work. And also just the way that I might process information. Certain things I'm slower to think through, and other things I'm just very quick. It depends on what it is. And I know that there are times, especially socially, that I'm thinking about something that someone said for probably months on end because I think I might have said something wrong. It happens quite a bit. And also just my sensory experiences are very, very profoundly different. Just like how I notice things like the thunder or the fact that I'm in my dad's office and I hear ticking clocks today and it is going to drive me up the wall for the next hour or so, even if none of you hear it. That's the thing that's really sensitive for me is I hear things that sometimes people don't always notice. And when we think about who is neurodivergent, there's an awful lot of people who are. And just to kind of give us a clearer picture of that, this is a non-exhaustive list of neurodivergent folks. So we have autistic people, we have people with ADHD, learning disabilities, and a lot of people just stop there. Primarily because these are the three groups that tend to either be overrepresented or the folks that we as people who are professionals and in the working world view as acceptable. And a lot of the times this falls into some superpowers narrative as well as, oh, these are the folks who are super productive. They're very creative. They're out of the box thinkers. They are very good at thinking about X, Y, and Z in this very specific way, or they have hyper focus or what have you. But I really want us to think beyond that stereotype and beyond those beliefs for just a little while, of course, and maybe even beyond that. Because I also want us to think about folks who are neurodivergent who might not get celebrated in the same way and face more stigma, such as folks with things like Tourette syndrome, intellectual disabilities. They might not have the same access to justice or access to even entering the legal profession and industry the way that their not non-disabled peers may. People with mental health and psychiatric conditions, I know as lawyers, we love to talk about mental health. And also acquired cognitive disabilities. This is folks I'm thinking of who might be aging, Alzheimer's, dementia, or even something like a traumatic brain injury. And when I talk about all these things, you might be thinking, Haley, that sounds wonderful, but all these things have nothing in common. And if that's what you're thinking, you on the surface are right. Yes, they're all brain-based, they're all neurological or cognitive in some way, shape, or form. But the stigma and the fact that we're not always understanding is something that's very universal. And it turns out that I have more in common with people who have intellectual disabilities, mental health conditions, and other things than I think that I do a lot of the time. And also, these things don't just exist in a vacuum. Neurodiversity and neurodivergence and different experiences do intersect. There's a lot of autistic people who have ADHD, for instance, or lots of people who have more than one mental health condition along with something else, that there are so many different ways to be neurodivergent. And something else that I want to point out to all of you, since this is Disability Pride Month after all, is that disability and neurodiversity are very unique in the diversity conversation, in the fact that it is the only minority group that you can join at any point in your life just by being lucky enough to be alive. Everybody, if you want to get philosophical about this, is temporarily able-bodied or temporarily neurotypical. And I say this in the fact that our bodies change as we age, or something can happen to us. I think about a colleague of mine from law school who was in a car accident our one all year, and she ended up having a traumatic brain injury. She kind of struggled with vocabulary recall and had other different physical issues related to this accident. Don't worry, guys. She's totally okay. She had a baby about a year ago. She's doing wonderful. She's happy, all that good stuff. She made partner last year. Things are going good for her. But I tell you this story because it's just that in a split second, her life changed in an instance, and she was a very good friend of mine. But it's just something that I think about when we talk about how this is very temporary. Because so often we come to topics like neurodiversity and disability thinking this is something that affects other people. This affects my kids, my family, my friends, somebody who isn't me, at least not directly, or it only affects me indirectly. But really, this is an everybody topic, and some of us just happen to have been born with a disability of some sort and don't know any different. That's my take on it, but acquired disabilities and acquired neurodivergence are still very much a thing. And that also makes it one of those topics I'm like, you should care and that you should be as excited about as hopefully everyone else is, because it can end up impacting your life very much so. But when we talk about our profession, it doesn't seem as apparent perhaps as it does when we talk about this in the world outside of the legal industry and practice. Historically speaking, lawyers with disabilities are not great at self-reporting having a disability. That compared to the general population, we seem to really not be great at that. And when I say that we're not great at that, I did not go to law school because I'm good at math, but I know enough to know that self-reporting at above 1% is not the same as the 1 in 4 Americans or 25% who have a disability, or about 15% globally. I know those numbers are not the same. And there's things that I also find very interesting here too, is that the American Bar Association in particular really does enjoy having these mental health and wellness conversations. I know as lawyers, we love mental health and wellness. I love mental health and wellness. I serve on Florida Lawyers Assistance Board, and that is all about mental health and substance use and essentially making sure lawyers and staff get support. I love that stuff, but our profession isn't always good at it. So usually when we talk about well-being and mental health, we talk about anxiety, depression, substance use. And the ABA did this really big study on these things back in 2018. They found, of course, that anxiety, depression, and substance use are happening amongst lawyers at higher rates than the general population in public, which I know to some of you may or may not be a surprise. But the thing that really stood out to me in this study more than anything is there was a number that was that lawyers basically, up to 12.5% of them, in fact, reported having or meeting the criteria for an ADHD diagnosis. And then the study never talked about it again. I have a lot of questions about this, and that is pretty significant compared to the general population of who has ADHD, especially as adults, and who also gets access to services. There's a lot we can unpack here, but we didn't get enough data to do that, unfortunately. Other things worth pointing out is that lawyers with disabilities do have salary and employment disparities compared to our non-disabled colleagues. So historically speaking, we are more likely to be unemployed. This is true across the board for people with disabilities, that we have higher unemployment rates compared to our non-disabled peers. And we also have lower starting salaries compared to non-disabled lawyers, especially at the entry level. That median number is about $10,000 in that disparity compared to non-disabled peers. And this is something that doesn't just check out for lawyers, but this also checks out across the board for professions that require advanced degrees. So historically speaking, the more educated a person with a disability is, the wider that salary gap becomes. It's an unfortunate reality that was really kind of detailed in a white paper by the Ruderman Family Foundation a couple of years ago. And it's something that I've been thinking about ever since, and why these things are happening too. And I don't want us to just be focused on the doom and gloom. It's very easy to get caught up in that. But really, we benefit from having people who are unique problem solvers and having different approaches to legal issues and strategy. So we are better for having neurodiversity in our profession. I can tell you many stories about my beginning practice time where I was very excited to be the new person, to be the neurodivergent person on the team. And I had ideas and strategy ideas and different things floating around my brain that perhaps the others in the room weren't thinking of. And it was very exciting because that's also how I won my very first motion as someone who knew absolutely nothing at the time. And somehow this, I have this hunch that this doesn't seem right. I want to go down a research rabbit hole and hyper focus on something for an hour or two and then come back. And turns out that was the thing that we were missing, and we all had no idea. And it was very cool, and it made me feel very confident as a 24-year-old who felt like she knew nothing. So I'm very grateful for that experience, as well as many others that I've had as a neurodivergent lawyer and human being. But I also want to talk a little bit more about neurodiversity employment before we go into the deep stuff on stigma, microaggressions, and things like that. But when we talk about neurodiverse employment, I want us to know about the benefits, that it's not just, of course, our how we solve strategies and how we come up with new innovations, but the tech sector has been a lot more at the forefront on neurodiversity at work than we have been. And for many years now, they have been actively recruiting neurodivergent people. And it turns out that when that happens, they have increased productivity, innovation, they're creating fixes and innovations and things that save them money, that increase their productivity, their loyalty, all these good things that end up happening. Sometimes I find myself cautioning against them because I don't want us to burn people out. I want us to take care of everybody and everyone feels valued and respected. There's also something very interesting that happens is that when we have the employment of people with disabilities, that companies do better. They make more money. There's higher shareholder returns and revenues than those that do not include disabilities. And usually what happens here is we will say things like hiring people with disabilities is good business. Disability inclusion, good. We feel warm and fuzzy inside about it. It just makes us feel like good people. It's a moral imperative, but really it's a good business decision. I know. I hate to burst the bubble on that, but it really is true. And it's really interesting when the data suggests that it's a good business decision. On top of the fact we have the favorable public opinion that I can't always necessarily quantify with data, but it's the thing that actually happens. And this is the warm, fuzzy feeling I was talking about. So what happens with the warm, fuzzy feeling here is something that I'm also guilty of as a person. I go to grocery stores like the rest of us. And my local grocery store is absolutely fantastic at hiring people who have Down syndrome, autism, and other forms of cognitive disabilities. Needless to say, I feel awesome about supporting them. My favorite cashier at my local grocery store has Down syndrome. I get hugs and handshakes and high fives every single time I go. It makes me feel good. This person is part of my community. They're being paid a fair wage. Everything is fine and dandy. It makes me feel good about it. I do not have any math to tell you why that makes me feel good about them, as to opposed to supporting the other grocery store down the road that's a little bit closer to my house. But this is just how, the cookie crumbles. And finally, we benefit from working with people who are different than we are. If we all thought the same, we would probably be robots anyway. So it's good that we work with people who have different approaches and life experiences than we do. And then I think about the disparities as well as how few of us are paid for the work that we're doing. And also for autistic people in particular, that the unemployment rate is supposed to be extremely high. That's what the data has tended to suggest over the years. And this is especially true for those of us who do have a college education or higher education, that we're either unemployed or underemployed. And I want us to focus for a second on being underemployed, because what happens here is probably the most common situation, is that you have really qualified, smart, hardworking people who don't get the same opportunities to move up, or whose skills and qualifications do not match the role they're in. For those of us who are in practice and aren't just the professionals in the room as well, or even if you are the professionals in the room, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. We're thinking about the person who's been at the firm for many, many, many years, who is a superstar of some sort. Maybe they're a little difficult to communicate with because we don't always understand them, but they don't seem to be moving up into leadership. They might not be making that jump from associate to partner. They might not be getting those senior promotions on the support staff, that things might not be happening even though they're perfectly qualified. This is something that happens quite a bit in the autistic and neurodivergent communities. You have some really talented people who bill, who do all the work, and who for some reason get passed over time and time again, usually because of some people skills or something that's very much, oh, you have to be more sociable, you have to do this a very specific way, or based on what we think is an ideal person or leader. This especially is true, I think, for my introverts out there. You're probably thinking, oh, yeah, the people who lead are very, very talkative or very good at commandeering, but there's many different ways to lead, and I digress. But when we think about paid opportunities and why people are unemployed and underemployed, usually people are very quick to assume it's policy related, which there's lots of policy implications that we can be thinking about, whether it's losing benefits, whether it's receiving benefits, whether it's our supports in place and all that stuff. But the thing that I really want us to think about that seems very universal, especially for our folks who are neurodivergent or disabled and already employed or already working or already alongside you, is bias and stigma and microaggressions. I really want to start us off here because this is the big thing that I still face and the things that I still deal with too. And just to kind of give you a picture of that on the screen, I do have some of the biggest things that people will say to me, and the most common things that people say is things like, why don't you get that? It's so easy, or just try harder, apply yourself. Or my absolute favorite is, I never would have known if you didn't tell me. And on the surface, all of these things don't sound mean. They don't sound bad. They usually are very well intentioned, which is what makes it so complicated when we think about stigma and microaggressions surrounding neurodivergence. And we're going to unpack this just a little bit. The easy one here to unpack is, why don't you get that? It's so easy. This one always makes me feel self-conscious, to be honest. There's a lot of things I'm very good at. There are also a lot of things I am laughably bad at. And the things that I am laughably bad at are things that most people are pretty good at or can do very easily. One of these things in particular is driving. Now, I know that it's very easy to make a joke about being a bad driver, but for me, I cannot figure out how to park in a parking spot between the lines to save my life. I have been working on it since I was 15 years old, my friends. It still doesn't click. It clicked well enough once when I took the driving test because I somehow passed. So I do have a driver's license, but it has not quite clicked since. It just doesn't make sense in my brain. And then somebody will always say to me something like, that's so easy though. You did it once, or have you seen the people who are parking in the Walmart parking lot? And then they laugh at me. Or they tell me who's on the highway these days and that people can't drive and I could probably drive better than them. It doesn't make me feel any better. It just makes me feel self-conscious because this thing genuinely is very hard for me because of my disability. I laugh about it a lot, but at the same time, it's still very easy to feel self-conscious. And there are things that I know that I'm good at that you might not be. So let's all accept that everybody has their strengths, their weaknesses, and work together in order to help out with that. So one of the best things that people have ever done, which is pretty rare, is that they will give me some very good advice to practice parking. Or my favorite person actually said, you know what? One day when we have time, we're going to go somewhere on a weekend and we're going to practice it until you figure it out, and I will help you and we will do this. Like, that was so cool when somebody said, hey, let's actually work on this instead of, oh my God, that's so easy. Why don't you get it? The same kind of goes for the just try harder stuff. It feels very similar, but when somebody is giving their 100% and it doesn't look like you're 100%, that it could be very easy to think that they're lazy or they don't care or they're not trying hard. This was especially true when I was in school, not, let alone the workforce, is I had to use all this extra energy to appear socially competent, to make friends, to not be overwhelmed by my environment. And sometimes the work itself did not get as much time spent on it, even though I was able to do it. And sometimes that work, it's not that the quality was bad necessarily, but it just wasn't spending as much time. I wasn't studying as much. I wasn't researching as long. And it still was like, oh, just try harder, then it'll be perfect. It's like, I'm trying really hard. I'm trying hard to keep up with the demands of my job, of my home life, of my social life, of the inter-office thing, and do what you're expecting of me. Most people don't have to think like that. And I think it's okay to accept that my 100% might be your 80%. And that's okay. That's just how our brains work and make sense of the environments that we're in. And the biggest one here that I want to point out is, I never would have known if you didn't tell me. Something about neurodiversity that is really complicated for a lot of folks is you can't tell just by looking at someone that they're neurodivergent. We also have a lot of stereotypes and beliefs about what a neurodivergent person looks like. We primarily think that they are children, and we primarily think that they are boys. So, needless to say, when you have neurodivergent people who are adults who are not cisgender men or boys, people get very confused. And also, just who has access to diagnoses, we can kind of go down the line of stereotypes on who is portrayed in media, and it usually doesn't fall in line with people that we expect, or they think it's going to be a scientist. And what happens to me is I never would have known if you didn't tell me. You seem so social, you're female, you're this, you're that. And what's really interesting about this is I realize it means that people don't always have a lot of exposure to neurodivergent people. And also, they don't realize how much work I'm doing to make them feel comfortable. There is something in the neurodiverse world known as masking or camouflaging. And what happens here is that we're basically suppressing different traits in order to appear socially competent to avoid different consequences socially. That we don't want to be bullied, we don't want to be harassed, we don't want to be discriminated against, we don't want to be treated differently. We want to be treated just like anybody else, right? And people don't realize how much work that takes. So I might purposely be making more eye contact. I might be purposely smiling more. If you've ever worked at a restaurant, or if you've ever worked in a retail job before you got here, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about, where you've had to smile and nod and have a very specific outgoing vibe, even if it wasn't you. And then you come home at the end of the day and you're exhausted. That's what it feels like if you're a neurodivergent person masking. And all of these things have roots in what's known as ableism, which is essentially our prejudices, our bias, and things like that. So I want us to really be mindful of what ableism looks like and how it shows up. But a lot of it really comes from this belief that something is wrong with you, that you're a failed version of normal, a broken person, and need to be fixed in some way. That's the biggest lie that we're being told, is that it's really just a different way of existing and being, more so than that we're broken or something's messed up. So I want to help us understand ableism a little bit better, because that's the thing that gets the messiest for a lot of us too. Is that, yes, we're talking about prejudice and discrimination and stereotyping and treating people differently. But something that I want to point out comes from a scholar and activist by the name of T.L. Lewis. And Lewis points out that this is something that interacts with all sorts of different systems and how we assign worth and how we assign value to people based on fitness and intelligence and all these other factors, desirability, whatnot. But something that Lewis points out at the end of the definition of ableism is that you don't have to be disabled or neurodivergent to experience this. And I've thought about this for a minute, because the first time I read this, I did a kind of a double take. And then I realized this is true. I think about people who have regular exposure to people with disabilities, who might be non-disabled, and the way that they're treated. For instance, when my parents get called heroes, or that people congratulate them when I'm right there and don't talk to me. Or even one of my dear friends is a special education teacher, and people will tell her that she is a saint for her job. And she will look at me and I'll look at her, and we both are like, "You're not a saint." And not because she's not a good person, but she's very passionate and she's still doing the work for the same reason many of us do a job that we have, or a career. We're passionate. We need to have food on our table, a roof over our head. We have to provide for a family. We have reasons that we're employed, and we're not all volunteers. So I thought that was very interesting. And also the way that I get treated when I'm with people who have more apparent or physical disabilities, that it's assumed that I'm their voice or that I will do things for them. And it's very strange. I went to lunch with a colleague who has cerebral palsy and is a wheelchair user a few years ago. And at the lunch, the waitress kept talking to me and asking me what he wanted to order. And I remember looking at the waitress being like, "You should just ask him. He's the attorney here who went to Yale. He's the smart one here." And I just laughed and told her to ask him, because he obviously was very capable of ordering for himself. And it's just an interesting way of how we get treated, not just people with disabilities, but the people around them, or even just the way that these systems interact. And also the way that we experience ableism and even interact with it. I'm not here to say I'm anti-ableist, because that's not true. I have my own ableist biases and tendencies, just like the rest of us. is that it can be very internalized, which we'll talk about, or very obvious. So usually people think the obvious is when we don't have the ramp, we don't have closed captions and things like that. But it's also not always something we're very aware of or conscious, such as the language we use. Something that I'm trying to do better at is stop saying things like crazy and insane. It takes a lot of work, but sometimes I'm getting better at it because I want to be not using language that can inadvertently be mean or offensive to people with mental health conditions and help destigmatize them as much as I can. This is just stuff that I'm able to do and hopefully stuff that we're all able to do. And kind of touch a little bit more on internalized ableism for a moment. I want us to think about what this looks like when you begin to believe these stereotypes, these different things about yourself, is that when you actually need help, you think that you're burdening other people by asking for help. You might think that something is wrong with you, or you might think that you're not good enough, that somehow you have to overcome and transcend disability, when really you're just trying to do the best you can and get the same opportunities as anybody else, or that perhaps certain doors are going to always be closed to you no matter what. Which means we got to talk about disclosure because this is where it shows up in our lives and even under the Americans with Disabilities Act, is that there is so much stigma and there are so many things that feel messy, why would you want to even share this? Is sometimes something that I get asked. And I know there's many reasons people do and don't share. That people don't know that they're neurodivergent. There's people who are self-identified because they might not have had access to this information throughout their lives. There's people who just don't feel comfortable. But people do disclose for a variety of reasons. Generally speaking, people will share because they need an accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act or a similar piece of legislation. And usually what happens then is we get to start the accommodations process, all this good stuff. But a lot of people do disclose and volunteer this information, not because they always need an accommodation, but people want to be their most authentic selves at work, in their lives. They take pride in disability identity. That's what Disability Pride Month is all about. There's a lot of really cool people and history behind the disability rights movement that gets me excited and makes me very proud. I also like to be proactive and limit misunderstandings because a lot of the time, neurodivergent traits get misread and misinterpreted. Sometimes, if I'm very honest with people, they assume that I'm being rude or blunt with them when really that's not the intention whatsoever. It helps that they know that's just how I work, and then they can explain to me, like, hey, that might have hurt somebody's feelings. You should probably know that, rather than you're just a bad person. And a lot of people do view disability or neurodivergence as a strength or a superpower of some sort. You might see some of these narratives that are like, I have superpowers, or my autism is my superpower. Everybody has a very different approach on this. I personally do not view it as a superpower so much as this is just all I know. I don't know any different. I know I would not be the same person if I were neurotypical, and that's totally fine with me. I look at it as I'm more of a neutral at peace. I don't look at this as a bad thing. I don't look at this as a superpower because I don't know what it's like not to have it. So for me, it's very interesting. But if somebody does kind of identify with that, I think it's wonderful and really something special. I think I identified it more as a younger person. And then the older I got, I was like, I don't know any different. Who am I to say? Having a disability has made me in so many ways more resilient and creative in things that I know I probably wouldn't be otherwise. You have to learn to adapt a lot. And disclosure helps us understand one another. It helps us bridge those gaps and provide context about why people are the way they are and why someone might not have consistent employment or history. And also, when we talk about this, it really does allow us to start the accommodations process that we don't have to disclose unless you need an accommodation under the ADA. But we do have to provide reasonable accommodations to qualified individuals with disabilities throughout the entire life cycle. And really, what those are going to do is help us perform the essential functions of the job, which are the things that are important, those responsibilities that we are doing every day, and basically just let us do the thing that we're hired to do in the first place. I know a lot of times accommodations are very, very individualized, and it can be hard to figure out what might be a good idea. I know for me, I am horrible at asking for things. I don't always know what I need, but sometimes you can get some great ideas from other people, which is why I highly recommend the Job Accommodation Network as a place to check out and some ideas for accommodations and things that might be helpful for you or the people around you. And when we think about accommodations, there's a lot of misconceptions about them. that a lot of the time we think that they're going to be very difficult to implement. That, yes, they need to be reasonable, which means they can't be too impossible to put into place or ridiculously expensive. And that is basically what the legislation around that says as well. And employees have to prove that they're reasonable or that there's things that may make them reasonable in a situation. And then we can consider the undue hardship question. The other big myth is that most accommodations are very expensive when really the majority are zero or low cost with an average one-time cost of about $300. So that's not too bad. Any accommodation I've ever received or advocated for has cost absolutely zero. My absolute favorite accommodation in this world that I've ever put into place for myself, actually, because thankfully I did ask about this when I was in practice, is noise canceling headphones. Mostly because I had fluorescent lights when I was in office. They would hum all day, they would distract me. If I couldn't shut them off, I needed to block out the humming. So noise canceling headphones that I already owned were my answer, as long as I kept any volume on them low enough that I could hear if somebody was going to be talking to me or if my phone rang. So that was super helpful. I already own them. They make me happy. That's my sensory bliss. I got noise canceling AirPods not too long ago, and they have genuinely changed my life for the better. And it has cost literally $0 to anybody I've ever worked with. Just some things like that. And there is no one size fits all approach to accommodations. I want to be mindful of that. Is really understanding what might be hard for somebody or hard for you, and then starting that process of having that conversation and advocating for yourself can go an awfully long way. And speaking of advocating for ourselves, this is probably the hardest thing for so many of us to learn to do. As people in the legal industry, we're very good at advocating for other people, but advocating for yourself is a whole other ballgame. And the disability rights movement and so much of the self-advocacy movement is built on self-advocating, which is essentially making choices that affect our lives and allow us to be more independent. That we're really taking control, speaking for ourselves and alongside others, and making these decisions. A lot of the time, we think of self-advocacy as a very disability-specific topic. I try to challenge this because we are advocating for ourselves every day, even if we don't think we are. For instance, I know many of you are busy, like really busy people, and you still advocated to take an hour of your time to be here today. That's advocating for yourself. When you get home and somebody in your family asks you what you want for dinner, and you say, I don't care, you are choosing not to advocate for yourself. If you say, I'm craving pizza, that is self-advocacy. That is saying, I want something and I am taking that control of that decision. We can self-advocate all the time. And really, when we do it for us professionally, it makes things go really well. That we're able to empower ourselves and others around us. When we have accommodation conversations, I like to do this in a soft disclosure type way if I don't feel comfortable sharing. Or I can also make you feel good about it by telling you what helps me, or that you did something really well and to please keep doing it. For instance, I like to use things like I work best when, or it's really helpful when, or when you did this, it really helped me succeed. Like something that I might say is it was really helpful when you sent the meeting agenda in advance, or I work best when you give me clear instructions. All of these things help us get those accommodations. It helps people know that we're doing something good because you're getting positive feedback. Another big thing on advocating for ourselves that I want you to be mindful of, especially if you're in a disclosure situation or somebody discloses to you, is figuring out who needs this information. You don't want to inadvertently out somebody who might not be open about neurodiversity, who might not feel comfortable. I always like to ask people who else knows or if I can talk to somebody else. For instance, if I have to talk to somebody in human resources or a manager or supervisor or other colleagues, I always like to know that. And the best thing that I think that comes out of advocating for ourselves is we are able to better advocate for others around us too. One place I worked at had a fragrance-free policy, which I thought was absolutely whack at the time. And looking back, it was so smart because it was put in place because somebody had severe allergies. And it turns out that it ended up helping people who struggled with sensory processing and other stuff as well. And we were better for it, except I wanted them to clarify what that meant because I didn't know that only applied to perfumes and colognes. I was scared it meant you couldn't use anything. But apparently I was wrong. You were still allowed to, use basic hygiene products. But I wanted to make sure. And it was really important that we knew to stay away from really strong scents more than anything else. And that was one way we were able to make our small little place more inclusive of as many people as possible, except if you had a large perfume or cologne collection. And that way we didn't have people who were overwhelmed by the scents, and we didn't have people who would have allergic reactions, kind of a the more you know of advocacy. Which brings me to kind of what I'm hoping to see in the future before we eventually launch into questions and having this discussion further. So some takeaways and things I want us to really be thinking about are taking a strengths-based approach rather than looking at neurodivergence and disability through a deficits-based approach. That's so often the things that we're very good at and things that make us unique and assets to have around are the things we get judged for the harshest. For instance, we might be really detail oriented and people just think that you are lost in the weeds and can't see the bigger picture, or that you are an expert in something and it's kind of weird. I know a lot of us have niche practice areas and you are celebrated for that. Some of the neurodivergent people around you probably also have niche practice areas or very niche interests, but are looked at as weird for it. I like to think about this in terms of children, especially. So when we think about children, you know how you have a kid who probably is a superstar athlete and they play soccer. And we know this kid is going to be a soccer star, and we know that they are obsessed with all things soccer, and we don't think twice about it because this kid's going to be a varsity player. They're going to go to the FIFA World Cup. Things are going to be awesome for them. Yeah, exactly. And then we have their friend, and this kid's friend collects rocks, shiny rocks, gemstones, I don't know, volcanic rocks, whatever, something in geology. And instead of being like, this kid is also going to be an expert in some sort of way, like the other kid's going to be playing at the World Cup, we're just like, that kid's weird for collecting rocks. So let's have the same energy for the kid that we think is going to be a superstar athlete as we do the superstar geologist who is going to maybe know everything there is to know about rocks and tell me all about what is going on out there with these things that are in nature and in on the ground. That would be very cool. And that is still having a lot of knowledge about something and a certain skill set, even though it's very different than the athlete's skill set. And of course, you have a lot of neurodivergent and disabled people who are creative for having to exist in a world that isn't always built with them in mind and operating with honesty and integrity. We are blunt to a fault sometimes. I know that's something I'm guilty of, but I think you'd rather have someone who will give it to you for what it is than try to beat around the bush and figure it out and lie to your face. That is always how I like to approach things, and it's something that I thought was valued and apparently sometimes not so much, but it's an interesting way to live in this world and to navigate it as well. So, to help us be a little bit more inclusive, some ideas for us are really to lead with curiosity and vulnerability when we are open and direct with one another, especially if you're someone who is in a position of power or privilege. It helps the people below you and who are new to the organization feel comfortable opening up and sharing their stories and disclosing as well. Self-identification is a huge thing that pops up now and then, and we want people to feel safe. We want to have spaces that people feel comfortable and with leaders who care and are empathetic and kind and willing to be vulnerable themselves. Other things that fall into this is I want to help match people to things that they're good at. It's very easy to stereotype. It happened to me. I was assumed to be a computer genius, which I shockingly am not. And once I got to do things I was actually good at, like reading and writing and research, I was infinitely happier in practice. I also want us to communicate in ways that we mean what we say and say what we mean. One thing that I like to recommend when we talk about communicating and working well with others is kind of coming up with a couple of things about how to best work with you. This seems so simple, and some people take this very, very extreme to make it complicated. But what I like to do is tell people a couple things about how to work with me so that they don't feel like they're doing something wrong. I might tell people that unprompted phone calls make me nervous, which is true. I always think I'm in trouble if you call me unprompted. And I will tell you that if you haven't heard from me in a day or 2 days, to please send me a follow-up email or bump things to the top of my inbox. There's a very good chance that I mentally did not hit send or physically did not hit send, and that's okay. And I appreciate the reminder, and you're not annoying me. I tell that just as much for you as I do for me. And I want us to make things accessible for everybody, regardless, as much as we can. That's why I'm a big fan of things like closed captions, because it doesn't just benefit our hard of hearing folks, but it also helps our people who need visual information, who might be second language learners. There's so many different ways that designing with disability and neurodiversity in mind end up benefiting everybody, not just one group of people, but all of us. And of course, I won't want us to just be a checkbox in inclusion and really encourage that mentorship and leadership. So, a couple of things to help you on your allyship journey before we pivot over to questions. And we also have a CLE code for you. But I want us to really look at disability as part of the human experience and really acknowledging people for all that they are. A lot of the times I get kind of ignored when I explain something that's very difficult about the disability experience for me. It's like, oh, I don't see that. You're just you. You're just Haley. And I'm like, that's wonderful, but this thing is genuinely hard for me and I need your support. Don't be afraid to keep learning more. I am very glad and grateful that we're having this event, but I don't want this to be the end of your learning on disability culture, rights, and community. We can be here all day geeking out, but unfortunately, we are time limited today. Otherwise, I would happily geek out with you all about disability culture, rights, and community. It's okay to address your own fears and biases. I know that we all have them and we all feel certain types of ways. In particular, am terrible at asking for assistance and help. And I have had to address and really self-reflect on why I feel the way I do. We can also passively learn by following new people with different perspectives than we do on social media or LinkedIn, or even getting to talk to somebody here at the firm or beyond that has a different life experience or who has a disability or who is neurodivergent that perhaps we haven't talked to before. But one of the biggest things that I recommend for you to do is if someone does come to you or anything, don't be afraid to lend a hand and ask how you can support them. Because sometimes you might not know what to say or you might not know what to do, but asking how you can be supportive is a great step to figuring that out. And it really is an empathetic response that I wish I got more often. So I'm very excited to see what you will do in creating a neurodiverse future together. And of course, if you have any questions and if we run out of time or you want to say hi, please feel free to reach out to me in the way that feels most accessible to you. You can send me an email, you can say hi on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, whatever feels most accessible to you. And now I believe we have some time for questions and we can keep our conversation going.
Thank you, Haley, very much. That was really interesting. I've got a few questions that people have sent in. So the first one is, how would you suggest approaching a discussion with a colleague who has said something that's offensive or hurtful, even if there's no ill intention? For example, reacting to you disclosing a disability by responding that everybody has something, or people without ADHD, for example, making a joke such as, oh, the ADHD is real today, to someone that does have ADHD.
Oh, that's such a good question because I think everybody has a very different take on this, and it also depends on your relationship with your colleagues. So there are people that I have called in to learn and been like, hey, that's not true. Like when you said that about ADHD not being real or something like that, there's people I've had those deeper conversations with. And then there's people I just never felt comfortable having any sort of conversation with. I think it really is very relationship dependent. And also, if you want to call someone in privately and have that discussion, it really is up to you how you feel comfortable. Sometimes I have let those things completely go because I just didn't want to rock the boat in some way. And then there's times I'm like, I need to talk to you about this. Like, let's figure out how to have that discussion. So I like to look at this as a very figure out what works best for you and the people around you too.
Thank you. The second question is, how can we support neurodivergent colleagues if we don't know they're neurodiverse? Can it be hard to know it can be hard to know how to react if someone acts in ways that could be due to their disability or could just be due to kind of factors about their personality that don't stray into the realm of neurodiversity?
That's a great question. And I do think as well that we have that happen a lot is I don't know someone's neurodiverse. I think they might be, but I don't really know. I always assume that no matter what, you have neurodiverse people on your team. So I try to think of how can I build an environment that's most accessible for as many people as possible. But if I suspect that somebody's neurodivergent or that there's something that seems to suggest that, it's not my job to figure it out. I will make an assumption in my own brain. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a psychologist. I do not wish to have those conversations. And you can end up being weirdly discriminatory or weirdly mean if you end up saying, oh, by the way, I think you might be autistic, unless it's like your best friend. I've had that conversation with my best friend. I wouldn't have it with somebody that I've worked with. But what I will do is I might say, hey, I've noticed X, Y, or Z. Is there something I can do to support you in that? Like I might be like, hey, I've noticed you take a little bit more time than the average person on research assignments. Is there something I could do to support you or help you maybe focus, or if there's like a skill or something, like I will try to figure that out and basically open the door for someone to either share that with me or tell me what they need so that they could be successful. Because you don't have to even know that you're neurodivergent to know that something might be different or that something is difficult unnecessarily for you, perhaps, or even just because of how your brain works. So I always think it's our best bet to assume we have neurodiversity, period, and then realize there are things that we can do, and we could just ask people what they might need, even if they don't know what they need.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Just, I think we have time for probably one more. So what are some inclusive actions that we can take to ensure that our colleagues can show up, contribute, and thrive in our workplace?
Oh my gosh, there's so much that we could do. I think probably the best thing that we could do is really listen. And I want more community building. I know that's just me being super selfish because I've always felt very isolated in being neurodivergent at work, that I've always felt like it was just me. I felt that way in law school and I felt that way in practice. And then I see affinity groups pop up. There's things at the law student level now, there's things at the profession level, there's things within individual organizations and firms like different affinity groups. That stuff makes me super excited because you realize you're not alone. It's a very isolating feeling sometimes, especially if you don't have that. So I want more community and I want more people to be understanding, kind of like even what you were saying in the past questions, like people make these very minimizing, oh, so OCD, or I wish I didn't have ADHD type moments. And it's just very strange. So I want more people to lead with empathy and grace, because a lot of the times I think that certain neurodivergent things happen because of my brain or other people's brains. They're not necessarily moral failures or an indictment on their character. I know a lot of the time, especially when people are late to things, we assume that they did something wrong or that they are bad people. But really, sometimes it could be that you just lost track of time or your brain just didn't know what happened because you fell down a rabbit hole of looking at stuff. And then all of a sudden, an hour went by and you had no clue what the time was. But I want us to really just extend grace to people and realize there's so many different ways that we can show up and still be professional and still be good at what we do and still be good people.
I think that's a great note to end the discussion on that. Just trying to approach it with empathy and just bring your best self to work. Joe, you going to say anything in closing? You're still muted, Joe.
Yeah, thanks so much. Haley, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights on neurodiversity and rethinking neurodiversity in the legal industry. And Michael, thank you for moderating the Q&A with Haley. If you have any questions about disability disclosure or accommodations, please reach out to Julie DeLay. She is the firm's Director of Benefits and Wellness and is happy to have a confidential conversation with you. So again, thanks everyone for joining, and happy Disability Pride Month.